Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stone. Senator Hancock has a question, and then I think we'll be moving on to the next panel.
Yes, this is just to follow up on Senator Stone's comments and questions. Career technical education in prison is actually a very, very important piece of bringing down recidivism. As I'm sure you know, I believe it's something like it reduces the recidivism rate by 17%, which, given that we have a 60% recidivism rate, is a lot of human beings with better lives and more taxpayer dollars, et cetera. Last year, the governor signed SB 1391, a bill of mine, which will fully reimburse community colleges for providing credentialed and academic pathways and courses in our state prisons. I am wondering how we've been working now and developed a very fruitful partnership between CDCR and the community colleges. I wonder if the Labor Department and the WIBs are part of that, or how we can bring you in. And also, if you have discretionary money and some examples of how local WIBs and the community corrections boards at the county level have worked together, I would very much appreciate that, because that would be a best practice that we need to try to replicate. But I'm just wondering how you're involved in actually putting together some of the partnerships.
We partner very closely with CDCR. When people are released to their communities, they are directed to go to local workforce investment boards, often through a New Start program, in order to connect those individuals to job training and employment services that are related to the jobs that are in demand in that community. So there's a great deal of work in making sure that the skills that people are released with are related to the skills that are available in the region and in the community where they return to. So there's some planning going on to make sure that those things connect more directly. But we'd be happy to provide more information and have more discussion about that.
Especially about discretionary money and best practices, because those are the things we have to get out. Yes, as I remember, I think it was a bill that I did that gets EDD to provide the data to state prisons, the employment data, so that they can target their career technical education. And I think this is part of also the governor's long-term interest in having a sustainable correction system that rehabilitates and increases public safety. So thank you. I'm glad you're involved in that.
Thank you, Senator Hancock. Senator Roth, round two.
One brief question. Gentlemen, to tie into the questions of my colleagues, and in particular my colleague from Riverside County, with respect to individuals who have been incarcerated and the training that we provide, when I first came up here, someone mentioned to me that we spend money training individuals to be cosmetologists in the prison system, and then when they come out, they have a difficult time getting a license because statutorily we've put a barrier in front of them. Is anyone in particular in your organizations, as you go through this process, tracking the statutory obstacles that exist or impediments that exist for folks that we train to then get good paying jobs when they're out in the communities? And if not, I hope so. And if you are, I hope you're bringing those issues to our attention so we can deal with them in this building.
It's an issue that we aren't tracking in any systematic way at this point, but it's certainly a relevant issue that we've heard your concern over.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I would just add that in some of the partnerships that have developed across the state through the CCPs and AB 109 implementation are doing really incredible work in removing the barriers and obstacles to employment for ex-offenders who are going through their programs. In Sacramento, I encourage you to talk to Lee Seal, who's the chief of probation, who's done, I think, incredible work, and it's a model that should be replicated across the state in making sure that offenders have everything they need, the wherewithal to connect to the jobs that are most that are best for them.
My concern is that some of these impediments may be statutory.
Right.
And if they are statutory, then we need to address them up here in this building on both the green side and the red side. And unless they're cataloged and identified, then many of us won't know what specifically we need to address. So those of you who are on the front line in terms of job training and job placement, and hopefully tracking your performance with your new performance metric system, you're in the best position of any of us to track and catalog these statutory impediments and obstacles, and then present them to us so we can deal with them. And I'd ask that you do so if you are not already.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roth. Your question brings another one to my mind, which is, with the result of the passage of Prop 47 this past November, there's the opportunity for upwards of more than 500,000 Californians who have had a felony on their record for low-level offenses, which will now be prospectively defined as misdemeanors, will be able to file a form with a county office to have the felony removed from their record. And I wonder if there's a way for us to think about how we can communicate with those folks to let them know they now have greater opportunities than they had before, and how we plug them into the training that they'll need to get those jobs that they probably had written off for so many years because of the felony on their record.
Part of the role, in particular, of EDD's Workforce Services branch is to communicate out to the workforce system, the local boards, the one-stop centers. So something like that can certainly be clarified in a directive issued out to the system as one means to do that.
At the local level would make most sense. Thank you. So, colleagues, no other questions. Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Thank you, Mr. Rainey, and appreciate your steadfast focus and attentions to what's a complicated issue here.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our second panel overview of current programs and governor's proposals. And from the Department of Finance, we have Christian Osmenya, along with Ian Johnson, and Natasha Collins and Judy Hyman from the Legislative Analyst's Office. Welcome to you, and please join us. So I think we'll start with finance.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Christian Osmenya with the Department of Finance. I'm joined by my colleague Ian Johnson, and we appreciate the opportunity to discuss the governor's budget. As our colleagues from the Labor and Workforce Development Agency have described, the administration is focused on building and aligning programs to support effective transitions into the workforce. To that end, the governor's budget provides significant new resources for the state's education system, given the fundamental role its segments play in these efforts. In recent years, the state has made important changes both to funding and expectations for schools and community colleges, and has emphasized preparing students for the workforce as an important priority for these segments. Growth in Proposition 98 resources provides an opportunity to have an important conversation about how districts can orient their operations to address that priority. The administration's proposals for the 15-16 fiscal year further the state's ongoing work in these areas. They address three primary concerns. First, the entities focused on education and training often operate independently and may not have an incentive to currently to align their efforts to better meet the needs of students and employers. Second, many programs and colleges are not allocating available resources to support these kinds of programs for a variety of reasons. For example, the cost of offering technical programs is often greater than the cost of more traditional classes. And third, many existing programs may not necessarily prepare students for current workforce needs. As your agenda notes, the governor's budget includes nearly $900 million in 15-16 for the following proposals. $500 million for a new adult education block grant program, $250 million for a 3-year career technical education incentive grant program, $49 million for increased funding for certain courses at the community colleges, $48 million for an extension of the existing career technical education pathways program, and $29 million for apprenticeship programs. We'll talk in detail about the new adult education and career technical education grant programs. For context, the state has historically provided funding directly both to school districts and to community college districts for adult education. Formerly, school districts received restricted funding for adult education. Beginning in the 2008-2009 fiscal year, districts were authorized to use funding allocated for these programs instead for other purposes. With the enactment of the local control funding formula in 2012-13, school districts have been required to maintain at least the same level of spending on adult education as they did in 12-13. That requirement ends in 15-16. Community college districts receive funding for adult education through their general apportionments based on the number of students they serve in courses. When funding for those apportionments was reduced in recent years, the adult education programs were also impacted, often disproportionately to other types of instruction. Legislation enacted with the 12-13 budget appropriated $25 million for school districts and for community college districts to form consortia regionally and to spend 2 years planning for the ongoing provision of adult education, with the expectation of funding in the budget beginning in 15-16. These funds were allocated to 70 consortia, and the boundaries of the consortia are in general consistent with the physical boundaries of the state's community college districts. The goal of this planning process has been to determine how to target resources more effectively to meet regional needs, to integrate efforts across providers, and to articulate programs to create stronger pathways for students. The planning continues, and the administration's proposal builds on those efforts. As described, the budget includes $500 million for an ongoing basis for the adult education block grant program. The proposal intends to provide stability for existing providers. In 2015-16, the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the Chancellor of the California Community Colleges will determine the amount of spending school districts have been required to maintain for adult education since 2012-13. Funding in 15-16 will be provided directly to those school districts to maintain their programs. The superintendent and the chancellor would then allocate any remaining funds to consortia that have been established based on the need for adult education in each of the regions. In future years, funds would be allocated to consortia based on the amount of funds received in the prior year, the need for adult education in the region, and the effectiveness of providers in meeting those needs. Within each consortium, funds would be allocated to implement the plans developed by the school districts and the community college districts that are members of the consortium. Each of the consortia would form allocation boards to determine which activities in those plans should be funded in a given year. The members of the allocation boards would be chosen by the school districts and by the community college districts in each consortium and represent those entities interested in the role of schools and community colleges as part of the workforce system, as you've discussed in the prior panel. An allocation board would consist of officials from each of the following: a school district, a community college district, another adult education provider, such as a local library, a local workforce investment board, a county employment services office, the county probation department, and the general public. In developing this proposal, we worked to be responsive to the comments, concerns, and feedback we heard from those interested in adult education, and we've tried to address much of the feedback we've received, including by supporting stability for existing providers, providing flexibility at the local level for innovation in programs, clarifying roles within the consortia, and encouraging collaboration across sectors to improve outcomes. We understand that there are some ongoing concerns, and we intend to continue to listen and respond, recognizing the goals and frameworks of the governor's proposal as this process moves forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Ian Johnson, Department of Finance. So the administration's proposed career technical education incentive grant program is an education and workforce development initiative aimed at providing students with the knowledge and skills that are critical for moving on to employment or higher education. The purpose of this program is to encourage and maintain CTE programs meeting high-quality standards as we transition from the early years to the later years of implementing the local control funding formula. This proposal is a recognition that CTE is critical to education and workforce development in the state, and also the governor's recognition that CTE programs are expensive to run and require large upfront expenses, and also that CTE is still going through a transition within the culture of K-12 education, from a categorical program viewed by many as something sort of off to the side and not part of core instruction, to something that is very much part of core instruction and something that districts now have to plan for and include in their local control and accountability plans. In terms of the specifics of the proposal, this is a proposed 3-year program administered on a competitive grant basis, be administered by the Department of Education and funded with 3 annual installments of $250 million of Proposition 98 general fund. Applicants for the program could be 1 or more school districts, county offices of education, charter schools, or regional occupational centers, and these applicants would be required to meet minimum eligibility requirements, including providing a dollar-for-dollar match for any funds that are received and demonstrating a plan to continue their CTE programs after this 3-year program expires. In addition to these minimum eligibility requirements, applicants would be ranked based on their demonstrated ability to offer high-quality programs. For awards to be renewed in the 2nd and 3rd year of this program, grant recipients will be required to show that their programs have positive outcomes on students, including CTE coursework completion, high school graduation, and industry-recognized credentials that are being awarded. The administration had extensive engagement with CTE stakeholders when developing this proposal, and we think that it's a solid framework that will encourage and sustain high-quality CTE programs as we further solidify CTE's place within core K-12 instruction.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Collins.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Natasha Collins from the Legislative Analyst's Office. The Sergeant has distributed a handout, which I'll be speaking from. Great. Our presentation begins on page 1. The first panel and the Department of Finance have provided an overview of the state's broader workforce efforts. We're going to provide a little bit more background on that and then speak to a subset of workforce development, which are workforce education and training programs and the governor's specific proposals. We'll then provide our high-level assessment of the governor's proposals and the overall vision for state workforce and our recommendations. The state's workforce programs span a wide range of services, as you've heard, from direct services to training programs to support services like job search training and career development education. We estimate that between 3 and 6 million people access these services annually. This range is very large because different agencies collect data differently. So it's very difficult to determine an exact number of Californians that access these services. Within these 3 to 6 million, we estimate more than 2 million access workforce education and training. For the purposes of our analysis, we define workforce education and training as instruction in 5 core areas, which you'll see listed on page 1. These are areas that prepare students for the workforce and include basic math and English, English as a second language, and CTE, amongst others. Page 2 provides a table of the state's broader workforce efforts. As you can see, the state has a vast system with over 20 programs led by 5 primary agencies, and the state contributes about $5.5 billion in state and federal monies annually towards this system. The primary workforce and education training programs in this system are the California community colleges and programs administered under the California Department of Education. While this clearly represents an impressive system, it also represents a complicated one. As we heard from our first panel, coordination of this system is one of the primary goals of the state moving forward. On page 3, we indicate that we agree that coordination is certainly a laudable goal for the state, but we believe that it'll take time and a concerted effort in order to reach this goal. It's complicated by a number of things which you've already heard quite a bit about: different funding streams, different accountability systems, inconsistent data collection methods, different governance structures, to name a few. To ensure that the state does not move away with its decisions to coordinate this system, we have several guiding principles that we think the legislature should consider when it addresses new proposals in the governor's budget. These principles are outlined on page 3. We recommend that the legislature assess all new spending through the lens of the state's broader workforce efforts as indicated through the WIOA plan that will be submitted in 2016 and the existing WIA plan that the state has already put together. Second, we recommend integrating regional structures that already exist. We have various regional structures, and we recommend the legislature not create any programs that impose more regional structures on the existing ones. This could further complicate and fragment the system. Third, we recommend that there be accountability to the public. This means that the state needs to know who to hold responsible for the outcomes of a given program. with various structures and various programs, this can be a challenging task. Fourth, we recommend moving forward that the state avoid any further fragmentation of this large system by not creating new earmarked programs, but instead by providing flexibility to locals and holding them to strong accountability measures to get the results that we expect as a state. Last, we think the state should use consistent performance measures and data collection tools. This will allow the state to measure the system's progress towards those clear expectations and goals. We encourage the legislature to keep these principles in mind when considering the governor's 4 workforce education and training proposals, which we outline on page 4. The Department of Finance gave a great background on the governor's proposals, including the adult ed block grant, K-12 CTE, new categorical program, an extension of an existing program, and the augmentation to apprenticeship programs. I'll go to our assessment on page 5, since we've received somewhat of a background on these programs. We note that the governor's adult education consortia approach is consistent with the state's goal of better coordination in a number of ways. First, the proposal includes a broad range of workforce education and training providers and stakeholders in the decision-making processes of the adult education block grant and the way the money is spent and the way services are administered. We also believe that this consortia effort really has the potential to foster communication and coordination across adult education providers and has already done so in the first 2 years of planning. We also believe that it could promote local solutions to better meet workforce needs because it provides flexibility to locals and how they spend their allocated dollars. Lastly, we believe it sets expectations it does set expectations on how consortia will report various data elements to the state, and it links some of the funding moving forward to those performance metrics. While the governor's proposal certainly has merit, we have several concerns which we begin to outline on page 6. The adult education proposal put forth by the governor complicates accountability in a number of ways. For example, there are not clear expectations or specific goals set forth in his proposal for adult education outcomes. Furthermore, it's unclear who would be held responsible for the outcomes of these consortia, whether it would be providers, allocation boards, or the consortia themselves. Moreover, it's unclear how many individuals would be served by this new funding stream, or what amount consortia would spend on a given student. That's also left up to consortia and not made clear. Lastly, we note that there are no consistent and common definitions of what data the consortia should collect annually. Our second overarching concern with the governor's proposal is that it furthers fragmentation of an already complex system. Regarding the adult education proposal, while in some ways it helps coordinate the system and gets folks talking amongst the state and how they're providing adult education, other funds that also go towards the same purpose are not included in the proposal. So that could include federal WIA money, Perkins money, and some other pots of money that go towards adult education. On CTE, creating a new CTE program, as well as extending a program that was set to sunset this year, runs counter to the goal of better integration. Lastly, the apprenticeship proposal is maintained as a separate categorical program, while at the same time included in the adult education block grant as one of the 5 areas to which these funds can go. We see this as being duplicative. On page 7, we address these concerns with some high-level recommendations for the legislature to consider. We will provide specific recommendations to the individual proposals in our subcommittee hearings, and you can read about them in our Proposition 98 analysis that we released earlier this month. First, we recommend funding the adult education block grant, but with several modifications. These modifications would include incorporating or at least better coordinating other workforce education and training funds into this block grant, funding such as apprenticeship. Second, We believe the legislature should require the Department of Education and the community colleges to provide it with the statewide allocation plan. As it stands, the legislature will not see this plan before money is distributed. We think the legislature may want to weigh in. That could occur in spring of 2015. Next, we recommend rejecting proposals that create new programs or temporarily extend existing programs, as it contributes to fragmentation. Our second overarching recommendation is that the state strengthen data and accountability systems for workforce education and training programs overall. A focus on holding providers responsible for student outcomes while giving them flexibility at the local level to meet their needs is consistent with the approach that the state has taken with the local control funding formula in K-12, where we're more concerned in how regions meet their goals rather than in the specific steps they take in order to reach them. In order to strengthen accountability and data, the state would need to take several steps. First, as Senator Roth mentioned earlier, we would need to set very clear performance expectations and goals for our providers. Then we would need to identify the data that the state would need to collect in order to measure these goals and track whether or not providers are reaching them. This would include metrics such as completion rates, job placements, and other metrics. After that, the state would need to develop procedures in order for providers to be able to report this data. For example, we would need to administer consistent collection methods. It could be as simple as a certain point in the year people would report how many unduplicated students they had served. We also need to take some other steps like establishing a common student identifier so we know if someone is moving across several providers or programs, what their outcomes are. Using this data, the state could then pivot and reassess its needs and where it would like to spend future dollars and investments in workforce education and training. This concludes our broad overview, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Collins, as always, very thoughtful. Ms. Hyman, you're here to answer questions. Great, okay. I think a good place to start might be to ask the Department of Finance if we could go back to page 6 of the LAO's paper. These are not insignificant shortcomings, and I want you to have the opportunity to respond, to say you're working on it, no, you think they are in place, whatever, and we could take them point by point.
Sure. Broadly, I don't know that we disagree with many of these proposals, and I would say, or many of the observations that the analyst office has made, and I think we are at the beginning of a process to rethink how the state does workforce development, and so many of these I think we hope to address as we move forward with the process of developing the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act plan. As we discussed, the adult education consortia are still in the midst of a 2-year planning process, and they'll be making, the chancellor and the superintendent will be making recommendations to the legislature and to the governor in March about future issues related to accountability, related to better coordination. So I think we agree that there's still work to be done in terms of developing these ideas and developing coordination in a coordinated system. To the initial point about specifically related to adult education and accountability, I think it is helpful to imagine that the consortia themselves are not providing direct services to the public, that there are still individual providers within consortia that are responsible for providing adult education in their regions. And so at a core level, these, as the LAO notes, these providers are really the entities that are going to be responsible for ensuring that they're providing effective services. We think that the consortia play an important role in figuring out on a regular basis, coming up with a plan and figuring out on a regular basis which providers can most effectively meet the adult education needs of their community. And I would turn it over to my colleague to answer any CTE questions.
Yes, I would just add that, with regard to the shortcomings listed here related to complicating or further fragmenting career technical education, I would say that the governor's proposal isn't isn't creating a new prescribed fragmentations. Rather, the approach that we're taking is essentially to provide characteristics of what we know are high-quality CTE strategies, and then leaving it to sort of local discretion to sort of design what those programs would look like. Two of those characteristics are regional partnerships with colleges and private industry, and then also a focus on regional and labor market demands. And so it's not that we're prescribing new regions, that could further complicate. Rather, we're trying to encourage the regions that are already there come together to apply for this program.
So with regard to setting clear performance expectations, that falls under, this is a work in progress that the consortia has yet to determine?
I would say so, and the superintendent and the chancellor are going to make recommendations to the legislature and to the governor about designing an accountability system for adult education, and I think with that information we can provide more, we can build on this proposal.
And do you have concerns about the suggestion that this is actually going to create greater fragmentation as opposed to greater coordination?
With regard to adult education, I think it refers to the governor's proposal to provide additional funding for apprenticeship. I think we're largely there balancing this effort to create a very a rational one, I think on one hand, creating a rational one funding stream for all programs, and then on the other hand, looking at existing models that work and investing in those efforts. And I think what the governor's proposal there represents a balance that the consortia should be considering the available funding sources across programs, and that's something that the proposed statute would require, and then also makes investments in what we believe is an effective model, as the labor agency had described, a learn and earn model, that we're combining investments made in on-the-job training by employers with state funds, and that's, I think, an approach that we think makes sense moving forward.